June 3, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, while America focuses all its attention on the Pacific, Japanese bombers suddenly appear over American soil, not in Hawaii, not in the Philippines, but in Alaska. Within days, Japanese troops will raise their flag on American territory for the first time since the War of 1812. Yet, this invasion, the only land battle fought on incorporated U.S. soil during World War II, remains one of history's most forgotten campaigns. This is the story of the Aleutian Islands Campaign, a brutal 15-month struggle fought in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, where soldiers faced an enemy that wasn't just the Japanese military, but also temperatures that could kill in minutes, winds strong enough to knock down aircraft, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Why would Japan invade Alaska? What strategic value could these barren, fog-shrouded islands possibly hold? And why has this campaign been erased from popular memory, overshadowed by more famous battles like Midway and Guadalcanal? Today, we're diving deep into the Aleutian Islands Campaign, a story of courage, strategy, and survival that deserves to be remembered. The Aleutian Islands stretch over 1,200 miles from the Alaska Peninsula toward the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. They form a natural bridge between North America and Asia, dividing the Bering Sea from the Pacific Ocean. In 1942, these islands were mostly uninhabited, known for their volcanic peaks, treeless tundra, and what military planners called the worst weather in the world. But location matters in war, and the Aleutians sat at a critical crossroads. For Japan, fresh off stunning victories across the Pacific, these islands represented both an opportunity and a threat. An opportunity to establish a defensive perimeter in the North Pacific, potentially threatening the U.S. mainland and disrupting supply routes to the Soviet Union. A threat because American forces based there could launch attacks on Japan's northern territories. For the United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and desperate losses in the Philippines, Alaska was the back door to America. Vulnerable, underdefended, and suddenly in the crosshairs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both nations in ways neither expected. This wasn't going to be fought on tropical beaches under palm trees. This would be warfare at the edge of human endurance, where the environment could kill you as easily as enemy bullets. The Aleutian Campaign officially began on June 3, 1942. When Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck the American naval base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island. But the roots of this campaign go back further, to Japan's grand strategy in the Pacific and America's desperate attempts to defend its massive, vulnerable territory in Alaska. To understand why this battle happened, we need to understand the strategic thinking of both sides in the spring of 1942. Japan was riding high on an unprecedented string of victories, but their leaders knew time was not on their side. The American industrial machine would eventually overwhelm them, unless they could force a decisive engagement that would bring America to the negotiating table. The answer was Operation MI, the plan to seize Midway Island and draw out the U.S. Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. But there was a secondary objective, Operation AL, the Aleutian invasion. The question historians still debate is whether the Aleutian operation was meant as a genuine strategic move or merely a diversion to split American forces before Midway. What we know for certain is that Japan assembled a significant force for the operation. 2 carriers, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 submarines, and 4 troop transports carrying 2,500 soldiers. This was no feint. Japan was serious about Alaska. June 3, 1942, began like most days in the Aleutians, shrouded in fog, cold, and gray. At Dutch Harbor, the largest American military installation in Alaska, sailors and soldiers went about their morning routines with no idea that enemy forces were already approaching through the mist. At 5:45 a.m., radar operators detected something unusual: unidentified aircraft approaching from the southwest. Within minutes, the air raid sirens wailed across Dutch Harbor. The Japanese had arrived. 23 bombers and fighters from the carriers Ryujo and Junyo swept over the base, their bombs and bullets tearing into ships, fuel tanks, barracks, and aircraft on the ground. The attack was devastating, but not entirely successful. The thick Aleutian weather that made these islands so miserable also protected them. Many Japanese aircraft got lost in the fog, unable to find their targets. The Americans fought back with everything they had. Anti-aircraft guns blazed away at shadows in the fog. Fighter planes scrambled to intercept the attackers, engaging in dogfights amid the clouds and mist. One Japanese pilot, struck by anti-aircraft fire, deliberately crashed his damaged plane into Dutch Harbor in what may have been one of the first kamikaze-style attacks of the war. The raid lasted less than an hour, but it sent shockwaves through American command. Japan wasn't just attacking distant Pacific islands anymore. They were striking at Alaska, American territory, the homeland. But the attack on Dutch Harbor was only the beginning. The next day, June 4th, the same day the Battle of Midway began, 1,500 miles to the south, Japanese bombers returned to Dutch Harbor for a second raid. Again, they inflicted damage, destroying fuel storage tanks and setting fires that burned for days. Yet something became clear to the Japanese command. Dutch Harbor was too well defended to capture with their current force, so they changed plans. On June 6th and 7th, while the Battle of Midway was ending in catastrophic defeat for Japan with the loss of 4 aircraft carriers, Japanese troops landed on 2 remote Aleutian islands, Kiska and Attu. Kiska, about 200 miles west of Dutch Harbor, had a small U.S. Navy weather station staffed by 10 men. The Japanese landing force of over 1,200 troops overwhelmed them immediately. The Americans had no chance to resist. They could only destroy their equipment and surrender. Attu, the westernmost inhabited island in the Aleutians, was even more remote. Its only inhabitants were 45 Aleut natives and 2 American schoolteachers, Charles and Etta Jones. When Japanese special forces landed on June 7th, there was no military garrison to resist them. The Aleuts were captured and eventually sent to prison camps in Japan, where many would die. The fate of the Jones couple remained unknown for years, though they were eventually confirmed to have died in Japanese captivity. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign military forces occupied American territory. The Japanese rising sun flag flew over American soil. The psychological impact was enormous. How could the United States claim to be defending democracy abroad when it couldn't even protect its own territory at home? Newspaper headlines screamed about the invasion. Politicians demanded action. The American public, already anxious after Pearl Harbor, now had enemy troops on U.S. soil to worry about. But the military reality was complex. The Aleutians weren't strategically vital to either side's war plans. They were remote, difficult to supply, and offered limited strategic value beyond denying them to the enemy. Some American commanders actually welcomed the Japanese occupation. It tied down Japanese resources and troops in a strategic dead end, far from the crucial battles being fought in the South Pacific. Still, political pressure demanded a response. You couldn't just leave American territory in enemy hands. Plans began immediately for a counteroffensive, but it would take nearly a year to mount. The Aleutians would test both nations in ways neither anticipated. For the Japanese garrison troops now occupying Kiska and Attu, the reality of their situation quickly set in. These islands were beautiful in their stark, harsh way, but they were utterly unforgiving. The almost constant fog and rain made air support unreliable. Supply ships struggled to reach them. The cold seeped into everything. The Japanese soldiers began fortifying their positions, digging into the frozen ground, building bunkers and gun emplacements. They were preparing for the American counterattack they knew would eventually come. But nothing could prepare them for just how difficult life would be on these islands. Similarly, American forces were building up their presence in the Aleutians, transforming remote islands like Adak and Amchitka into major military bases, constructing airfields in record time despite the impossible weather conditions. Engineers and construction battalions performed miracles, building runways on permafrost and muskeg that should have been impossible to build on.
From June 1942 to May 1943, the Aleutian Islands became the stage for a different kind of warfare. Not the massive naval battles that dominated headlines, but a grinding war of attrition, bombing raids, and preparation for the inevitable ground battle to come. For the Americans, the challenge was monumental. Build up sufficient force in one of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth to retake 2 occupied islands. For the Japanese, the challenge was equally daunting. Hold and fortify those islands while thousands of miles from their supply bases in weather that seemed designed to destroy armies. The Aleutian weather became as much an enemy as the opposing forces. Pilots called it flying in milk. Visibility could drop to 0 in seconds. Winds regularly exceeded 100 miles per hour, strong enough to flip aircraft and tear apart buildings. The famous Willy-Waw winds, sudden violent gusts that poured down from the mountains, could appear without warning and with deadly force. One pilot described it this way: "You could take off in relatively clear weather, and by the time you reached altitude, you'd be completely socked in. You couldn't see the ground, couldn't see the horizon, couldn't see anything but gray in every direction. And you had to find your way back to a runway that was probably also covered in fog." The casualties from weather and accidents exceeded combat casualties for much of the campaign. Planes crashed into mountainsides hidden by fog. Ships ran aground in the darkness. Men suffered frostbite and hypothermia even in summer. One estimate suggests that for every man killed by enemy action in the Aleutians, 3 were casualties of disease, accidents, or weather. But the military buildup continued relentlessly. The Americans established major air bases at Adak and later at Amchitka, bringing them within bombing range of the occupied islands. These bases were engineering marvels, built in weeks on terrain that should have taken months or years to develop. The construction crews worked in conditions that defied description. They laid steel matting over the soggy tundra to create runways. They built everything, knowing the wind might tear it apart the next day. They worked through the white nights of summer when darkness barely came, and through the long, dark winters when the sun barely rose. Meanwhile, American bombers began a systematic campaign against the Japanese positions on Kiska and Attu. Day after day, when weather permitted, bombers would fly through the fog and clouds to drop their payloads on the occupied islands. The Japanese, unable to receive reinforcements or supplies easily, huddled in their bunkers and endured. These weren't the massive 1,000-plane raids being conducted over Europe. Often just a handful of bombers would make the dangerous flight through the weather, drop their bombs, and hope they could find their way home through the fog. But the cumulative effect was significant. The Japanese garrisons were being worn down, isolated, and demoralized. Japanese soldiers on Kiska and Attu kept detailed diaries that were recovered after the war. They paint a grim picture of life under siege. One soldier wrote, "The fog is so thick we cannot see beyond a few meters. The dampness penetrates everything. Our food supplies are moldy. The bombing continues whenever the weather clears. We wonder if we have been forgotten by the homeland." They hadn't been forgotten, but supplying them was nearly impossible. Japanese submarines attempted supply runs, but the weather and American patrols made it incredibly dangerous. Surface ships rarely got through. The garrisons were slowly starving. By early 1943, American intelligence estimated that the Japanese had about 2,500 troops on Kiska and another 2,500 on Attu. In reality, the Attu garrison was smaller, around 2,300 men, but they were well dug in and prepared to fight to the death. The American High Command debated strategy. Should they attack Kiska first, the closer island with the larger garrison, or Attu, the more remote but smaller outpost? The decision was made to attack Attu first. It would be the proving ground for cold-weather amphibious assault tactics that might be needed later if the war extended into northern Japanese territory. An invasion force was assembled, over 11,000 American troops, mostly from the 7th Infantry Division, which had been training in the Nevada desert and California, not exactly ideal preparation for Arctic warfare. They were supplemented by scout units who had actually trained in Alaska and knew something about cold weather operations. The naval force included 3 battleships, an escort carrier, 6 cruisers, 19 destroyers, and various support ships. This was a major operation, comparable in scale to the early Pacific Island assaults, but it would take place in far worse conditions. As April 1943 turned to May 1943, the American forces gathered at Cold Bay and Dutch Harbor, waiting for a weather window to launch the invasion. The men were briefed on their objective, issued cold weather gear that was inadequate for the conditions they'd face, and told to prepare for tough fighting. One major told his men, "Attu will be cold, wet, and miserable. The Japanese are well fortified and will fight hard. The terrain is against us. The weather is against us. But Attu is American territory, and we're going to take it back."
May 11th, 1943. The American invasion fleet approached Attu through dense fog and rough seas. Many of the soldiers, packed below decks in transports, were already seasick before the battle even began. As they neared the landing beaches, the fog lifted slightly, enough to reveal Attu's stark, forbidding landscape. Attu is dominated by steep mountains rising directly from the sea, with narrow valleys between them. Snow still covered the higher elevations, even in May. The whole island is only about 35 miles long and 15 miles wide, but its terrain made it a natural fortress. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, had positioned his 2,300 men brilliantly. Rather than defending the beaches, he pulled most of his forces back to the high ground, planning to use the terrain to maximum advantage. His men had built elaborate bunker systems into the mountains, using the volcanic rock and permafrost to create positions that were nearly invisible and extremely difficult to assault. The Americans planned a 2-pronged landing, one force at Massacre Bay on the east side of the island, another at Holtz Bay in the north. They expected to secure the landing beaches quickly, then drive inland to linker and crush the Japanese positions in between. On paper, it looked simple. In reality, it would be anything but. The landings began on May 11th, in relatively light opposition. The Japanese, following their strategy, let the Americans come ashore. By the end of the first day, over 2,000 American troops were on Attu, and they'd suffered only light casualties. Commanders were optimistic. Maybe this would be easier than expected. They were wrong. As American forces pushed inland, they discovered the true nature of Attu's terrain. What looked like gently rolling tundra from the beach was actually a nightmare of hidden gullies, steep slopes, and muskeg, waterlogged moss and soil that could swallow a man to his waist with each step. Soldiers carrying 70-pound packs found themselves exhausted after moving just a few hundred yards. Then there was the cold. Temperatures hovered just above freezing, with constant wind and rain. The American cold weather gear was inadequate. Soldiers' boots weren't waterproof. Within hours, everyone had wet feet. Trench foot began appearing almost immediately. Men who had trained in the Nevada desert were now fighting in conditions closer to the Arctic. And then the Japanese opened fire. Colonel Yamasaki's men had waited patiently, letting the Americans struggle inland, exhaust themselves, and spread out. Now, from concealed bunkers and caves in the mountains, they opened up with machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Americans found themselves pinned down in the open, taking fire from positions they couldn't even see. One survivor described it, "You'd be advancing across what looked like empty ground, and suddenly the guy next to you would drop. You'd hit the dirt, look around, and see nothing. No muzzle flash, no enemy soldiers, nothing." They were firing from bunkers built right into the hillside, with tiny firing slits. You could walk within feet of them and never know they were there. The American advance ground to a halt. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a brutal slog. Each bunker had to be located, approached across open ground under fire, and then destroyed, usually with grenades or flamethrowers, requiring soldiers to get right up to the firing ports. The scout units, particularly the Alaska Scouts and combat engineers, became specialists in bunker destruction. They used smoke or fog for cover, crawl close enough to throw grenades or satchel charges into the bunkers, and then rush in to finish off any survivors. It was terrifying, exhausting work, and casualties mounted steadily. The weather continued to be as much an enemy as the Japanese. Fog rolled in for days at a time, making air support impossible and causing units to lose contact with each other. The cold sapped energy and morale. Supplies couldn't keep up with the troops advancing inland, so men fought on short rations, often without fresh water. Medical evacuation was a nightmare. Wounded men had to be carried back across the same impossible terrain they'd struggled to cross going forward. Many died not from their wounds but from exposure during the journey back to aid stations. By May 18th, after a week of fighting, the Americans had advanced just a few miles and taken several hundred casualties. But the Japanese situation was becoming desperate. They were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. American forces were slowly tightening the noose, clearing bunker after bunker, mountain after mountain. Colonel Yamasaki knew his position was hopeless. His men were starving, many were wounded, and ammunition was critically low. He could surrender, or he could choose the path of Bushido, death before dishonor. He chose the latter and began planning what would become one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. On the night of May 29th, after 19 days of fighting, Colonel Yamasaki gathered his remaining forces, about 800 men, many of them wounded, all of them exhausted and starving. He gave them the order. They would attack at dawn, break through American lines, capture the American artillery positions and supply dumps, and either turn the battle around or die trying. What happened next shocked the American forces and became one of the most dramatic moments of the entire Aleutian Campaign. At dawn on May 29th, the Japanese launched their attack. They came screaming out of the fog in a massive wave, some with rifles and bayonets, some with just grenades or swords, and some with nothing but their bare hands. The Americans, many of them sleeping or just waking up, were caught completely off guard. The banzai charge swept through American positions, overrunning medical tents, command posts, and artillery positions. In savage hand-to-hand fighting, Japanese soldiers who moments before had been too weak from starvation to stand fought with desperate fury. The Americans fought back just as desperately, using rifles, pistols, knives, bayonets, even entrenching tools and fists. The battle devolved into chaos. Units got mixed together in the fog. Friend and foe were indistinguishable in the gray dawn light. Men fought and died in small groups scattered across the valley. But the Japanese charge, for all its fury, couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of war. The Americans had superior numbers, eventually reorganized their lines, and brought overwhelming firepower to bear. By mid-morning, the charge had been stopped. Colonel Yamasaki lay dead among his men. The Japanese force was effectively destroyed. In that final charge, over 500 Japanese soldiers died. Another 29 were taken prisoner, most of them too badly wounded to commit suicide. For American forces, the banzai charge caused over 550 casualties, including 29 killed in the medical tents. When the shooting finally stopped on May 30th, Attu was back in American hands. But the cost had been staggering.
549 Americans killed, 1,287 wounded, and another 1,200 incapacitated by disease, cold, and injury. The Japanese garrison of 2,300 men was virtually annihilated, only 29 taken prisoner, the rest dead. It had taken 19 days to recapture an island that commanders thought might fall in 3. The casualty rate was higher than the Marines would experience at Iwo Jima 2 years later. One officer called it the worst ground fighting in any American theater of war to that date. But Attu was finally back in American hands. Now came the question, what about Kiska?
After the brutal experience on Attu, American commanders knew that Kiska would be even worse. Intelligence estimated the Japanese garrison at around 10,000 men, actually an overestimate, but they didn't know that. Kiska was closer to Japanese supply lines, better fortified, and the Japanese had had over a year to prepare the defenses. The Americans weren't taking any chances. They assembled an invasion force of over 34,000 troops, Americans and Canadians, making it one of the largest amphibious operations of the Pacific War. The fleet included 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, an escort carrier, and numerous destroyers and support ships. For 2 months after Attu fell, American forces bombed Kiska relentlessly. Battleships moved in close to shell the island. The island was practically obliterated from the air and sea. Every possible Japanese position was hit again and again. The Americans were determined not to repeat the Attu experience. The Japanese garrison on Kiska watched all this and knew their situation was hopeless. Unlike Attu, they had maintained better contact with Japanese high command. A plan was formed for something unprecedented, a complete evacuation under the nose of American forces. The Japanese High Command authorized Operation Kego. If successful, it would be a brilliant escape. If it failed, thousands more Japanese soldiers would die in another futile last stand like Attu. On July 28, 1943, under cover of dense fog, the same fog that had protected and plagued both sides throughout the campaign, a Japanese task force of cruisers and destroyers slipped into Kiska Harbor. In just 55 minutes, they loaded all 5,183 Japanese personnel still on the island and disappeared back into the fog before American forces even knew they were there. It was a masterful evacuation, and it set up one of the most bizarre episodes of the entire war. The Americans didn't know Kiska had been evacuated. In fact, intelligence still suggested a large garrison was present. Reconnaissance photos showed buildings still standing, anti-aircraft guns still in place, even what looked like soldiers moving around, though these were actually just dogs left behind by the Japanese. On August 15, 1943, the invasion began. Canadian and American forces landed on Kiska expecting fierce resistance. What they found was an abandoned, booby-trapped island. But they didn't know it was abandoned at first. For days, troops advanced across Kiska expecting Japanese soldiers to open fire at any moment. Every abandoned bunker could hide an enemy. Every curve in the trail could lead to an ambush. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers fired at shadows in the fog. Different units, unable to see clearly, fired at each other. In what became a tragic comedy of errors, American and Canadian forces engaged in friendly fire incidents across the island. Men who had prepared for weeks to fight Japanese soldiers instead found themselves accidentally shooting at their own allies in the dense fog. By the time everyone realized the island was completely abandoned, the operation had cost 313 casualties, all from friendly fire, accidents, disease, and one unfortunate incident where soldiers triggered Japanese booby traps. Not a single casualty was caused by enemy action because there was no enemy present.
The press had a field day when the truth came out. The Battle of Kiska became an embarrassment for American command. How could tens of thousands of troops, supported by massive naval and air power, fail to realize they were invading an empty island? But military analysts saw it differently. Yes, it was embarrassing, but the alternative, a bloody assault like Attu against a garrison twice as large, would have been catastrophic. In a sense, the Japanese evacuation and the bloodless American invasion were the best possible outcome. The Aleutian Islands were back under American control without the additional thousands of casualties that another Attu would have cost. The Kiska operation demonstrated something important about warfare in the Aleutians. The weather and terrain were so brutal that they could dominate operations even more than enemy forces. The fog that allowed the Japanese to escape also caused American casualties through friendly fire. The same conditions that made the islands difficult for Japan to hold also made them difficult for America to take back. With Kiska secured, albeit in the most unexpected way, the Aleutian Islands Campaign was effectively over. Japan no longer held any American territory. The strategic situation had returned to the status quo before the invasion, but at a tremendous cost to both sides. For Japan, the Aleutian operation had been a costly diversion that tied up resources needed elsewhere, resulted in the deaths of over 2,000 soldiers on Attu, and ultimately gained nothing. For America, it had been a harsh lesson in cold warfare, cost thousands of casualties, and diverted resources from other Pacific operations. But both sides learned valuable lessons. The Americans gained experience in amphibious assault, cold weather operations, and joint operations between Army, Navy, and Air Force that would prove valuable in future campaigns. They also established a permanent military presence in Alaska that continues to this day. The Japanese learned, though at great cost, that their empire had overextended, that some objectives weren't worth holding regardless of the cultural importance of never surrendering territory. And with that, one of the strangest, most brutal, and most forgotten campaigns of World War II came to an end.
So, why has the Aleutian Islands Campaign been so thoroughly forgotten? Why does it remain a footnote in most World War II histories, overshadowed by Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Normandy, and countless other battles? Part of the answer is timing. The campaign coincided with major operations in both the Pacific and European theaters. When Attu was being fought in May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its climax, and planning for the invasion of Sicily was underway. The Aleutians seemed remote and strategically minor compared to these other operations. Part of it is the nature of the campaign itself. There were no massive tank battles, no dramatic naval engagements after the initial airstrikes on Dutch Harbor, no iconic photographs that captured the public imagination. The battles were small, brutal infantry actions, fought in weather so miserable that cameras often couldn't function. And part of it, frankly, is embarrassment. The campaign was sold to the American public as a crucial operation to defend Alaska and the West Coast from Japanese invasion, but strategically, it was a sideshow. The Japanese never intended to invade the mainland, and the Aleutians themselves offered limited strategic value to either side. The whole campaign could be seen as a massive diversion of resources that both sides would have been better off deploying elsewhere. But the forgotten soldiers who fought there deserved better than to be forgotten. They endured conditions that veterans of tropical Pacific campaigns called worse than anything they experienced. They fought an environment as much as an enemy. They proved that American forces could operate in extreme cold weather conditions, knowledge that would prove valuable in future conflicts. The Aleutian Campaign also had lasting strategic impacts that are still felt today. It demonstrated the vulnerability of Alaska and led to a permanent, substantial military presence there that continues into the 21st century. During the Cold War,
Alaska's position between the United States and Soviet Union made it a crucial front line. The bases and infrastructure developed during World War II became the foundation for Alaska's role in deterring Soviet aggression. The campaign also affected the indigenous Aleut people profoundly and tragically. Those who were captured by the Japanese often died in prison camps. Those who remained in American-held territory were evacuated from their homes and placed in internment camps in southeast Alaska, where living conditions were appalling and many died from disease. After the war, when they were finally allowed to return home, they found their villages had been destroyed or occupied by military installations. The U.S. government didn't formally apologize for the treatment of the Aleuts until 1988. Today, visitors to the Aleutian Islands can still see remnants of the campaign. Rusting Quonset huts, decaying bunkers, old airstrips slowly being reclaimed by the tundra. On Attu, which is now uninhabited, the battlefield remains much as it was in 1943, a remote, windswept memorial to a forgotten battle. There's a small memorial on Attu, accessible only by boat or aircraft, weather permitting. It reads simply, "In memory of those who served and those who died in the defense of their country in the Aleutian Islands Campaign, World War II." Few people make the journey to see it. The weather is still terrible. The islands are still remote. But the memorial stands as a reminder of what happened there, a reminder that deserves to be more than forgotten. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 1,500 Americans killed in action or died from disease and accidents. Over 3,700 Japanese dead, most on Attu. Billions of dollars spent in today's money to fight over islands that most Americans had never heard of before the war and forgot about shortly after. But numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you what it was like to fight in conditions where you couldn't feel your fingers, where the fog was so thick you could get lost 10 feet from your foxhole, where the wind could literally blow you off a cliff. They don't tell you about the soldiers who survived Attu and later died in accidents during training exercises in the Aleutians. They don't tell you about the families back home who lost loved ones in a campaign most people didn't even know was happening. The Aleutian Islands Campaign teaches us several important lessons that remain relevant today. First, geography matters. The Aleutians' position between continents made them strategically significant despite their harsh conditions. In an era of global conflict and great power competition, we're reminded that seemingly remote areas can become critical in times of crisis. Second, logistics and environmental factors can dominate military operations. Both sides spent more resources fighting the weather and terrain than fighting each other. Modern military planners still study the Aleutian Campaign as a case study in cold weather operations and the importance of proper equipment and preparation. Third, the campaign demonstrated that symbolic victories, like retaking American soil, sometimes matter more than pure strategic calculation. Politically, the United States couldn't leave American soil in enemy hands, even if the military value of that soil was questionable. This tension between political necessity and military strategy remains relevant in conflicts today. And finally, the campaign reminds us that history is full of forgotten stories that deserve to be remembered. The soldiers who fought in the Aleutians showed the same courage, endured the same fears, and made the same sacrifices as those who fought in more famous battles. Their story is no less important simply because it's less well known. In recent years, there's been a growing effort to bring the Aleutian Campaign out of obscurity. Books have been written, documentaries produced, and memorials established. Veterans organizations and historians have worked to ensure that this chapter of World War II isn't lost to time. The National Park Service has designated several sites in the Aleutians as part of the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument, preserving the battlefields and installations for future generations. Though few people visit due to the remote location and challenging conditions, the sites are protected and interpreted for those who do make the journey. Japan, too, has commemorated the campaign.
Japanese veterans and families of those who died on Attu have made pilgrimages to the island to honor their dead. In 1987, Japanese and American veterans of the Attu battle met there together for the first time since the war. Former enemies coming together to remember their fallen comrades and recognize their shared experience of that terrible battle. One American veteran of Attu speaking at that reunion said, "We were enemies then. We fought each other with everything we had. But we both fought the same cold, the same mud, the same mountains. We all suffered. War made us enemies, but suffering made us brothers." That sentiment captures something important about the Aleutian Campaign. It was a battle that neither side really wanted, fought over territory neither side particularly valued, in conditions that were miserable for everyone involved. Yet thousands died there, and those who survived were marked by the experience for the rest of their lives. As we remember the major battles of World War II, D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, the Bulge, we should also remember the forgotten battles like the Aleutian Campaign. Not because they changed the course of the war. They didn't. But because the soldiers who fought there deserved to be remembered. Because the lessons learned there remain relevant. And because every story from that global conflict, even the forgotten ones, is part of the larger story of human conflict, courage, and survival. The Aleutian Islands today are much as they were in 1942. Remote, foggy, windswept, and beautiful in their stark way. The weather is still terrible, the terrain is still unforgiving, but they're no longer a battlefield. The guns are silent, the soldiers are gone, only the wind and the sea remain, and the memories of those who fought there. The next time you look at a map of the Pacific, and your eye traces the chain of islands stretching from Alaska towards Russia, remember that this was once a battlefield. Remember that American soldiers fought and died there to retake American soil. Remember that Japanese soldiers fought and died there far from home for reasons that perhaps even they didn't fully understand. Remember the Aleutian Islands Campaign, the forgotten battle that deserves to be forgotten no longer. This has been the story of one of World War II's most overlooked campaigns, a story of courage, sacrifice, and survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing for more in-depth historical content. And perhaps share this video with others. These stories deserve to be told, and these soldiers deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping to ensure that the Aleutian Campaign remains forgotten no more.